This is a Chronicle podcast.
This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire.
Welcome to Chronicle's History Making Podcast, where we go behind the scenes of what it takes to make history documentaries. My name is Dan Jobson, director and filmmaker, and I'm here again with Michael Cove, creator, writer, and narrator of The Price of Empire. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you.
Well, today's episode, we arrive at the opening of the Second Front in Europe, D-Day. By the end of 1943, a number of key turning points of the war had already taken place. The Allied wins in Stalingrad, Midway, and North Africa. But in these later episodes, you point out that in January 1944, after losses of about 4.4 million, the German force was now at their greatest strength, 9.5 million men. So how was it that they didn't capitalise on this at the time?
Well, I think the first thing you have to remember is the proportionate distribution of those forces. And the other factor, of course, which is true of all countries once they're involved in a war of that intensity, is that the selection criteria are dropped. Progressively. People get, shorter and fatter and older, more breathless as the war goes on. So that sort of inflates the numbers, and it inflates them in a way which is a bit deceptive because they're not exactly frontline troops necessarily.
Right.
So one of the ways in which you can illustrate that is that there were reputedly 1 million German personnel involved in anti-aircraft and civil defence in consequence of the Allied bombing campaign.
Okay.
But some historians would argue fairly persuasively, in my opinion, that that's not to say that the Allied bombing campaign took 1 million frontline personnel out of the battlefield.
Sure.
They were not of that calibre.
They were never there in the first place.
No, they were people who were not fitted. not able, physically able perhaps, to perform frontline duties. Another thing that you read a lot is people say, oh, well, Hitler had this hang-up about Norway, and there were always, 12 or 15 divisions.
They did always station up there to keep the iron, isn't it?
Yeah, always stationed up there because he was persuaded, and he persuaded himself that the Allies were going to attempt to invade again, as they had in 1940. And then people say, well, those divisions could have been much better used elsewhere. And again, there are some historians who will point out that, first of all, those divisions were on a rotation, so that fatigued divisions or divisions that needed to be re-equipping
would get shipped up to Norway.
Yeah, could be sent there. So they weren't necessarily always frontline divisions, and they weren't always battle-ready divisions. So those sort of looking at figures and looking at the figure of 9.2 is another example of how just the sort of bald statistic is potentially misleading. Yeah. But as I say, the distribution is also significant, and the vast proportion of Axis forces were, of course, always on the Eastern Front. Something like 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio, something like that.
Out there, right? Well, speaking of those bald statistics, now a lot has been said about D-Day. Obviously, it's an astounding logistics achievement overall as well, but some of the facts in these episodes that I pull out that I found absolutely incredible were that 3 million Allied personnel were involved in the landings, and as you rightly point out, that was at a time where there was no mobile phones, no internet, so that level of organisation and secrecy just astounds me. Another one was that 60,000 captured Soviets were there fighting alongside the Axis powers at the same time. Others were that 75% of all Allied paratroopers landed in the lead up to that were not able to take part in the fighting because they landed in the wrong place.
I will just quickly say, because we will otherwise get extremely abusive. No, we'll get extremely abusive correspondence from former Red Berets if I don't. That the exact truth is that 75% of the paratroopers were not able to join combat on the first day.
Okay.
They did obviously get involved in the
D-Day
fighting.
+1 from there.
Yeah. In, if you like, the Normandy campaign and all of the subsequent actions leading up, of course, to the ill-fated Bridge Too Far episode of Market Garden. But they were, because they were not dropped in 75% of them were not dropped in the right place, they couldn't do what they were scheduled to do on the first day, but thereafter they were. So don't write in.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
But what would you say after your research and obviously after making numerous shows and all of your knowledge, what's the thing that you find most incredible about D-Day?
What do I find most remarkable? It's difficult, really, when you look at the scale of the operation and the complexity of it, to pick out one thing rather than to say it is the totality of it that is extraordinary. That when you look at it from any level, it seems to me remarkable how many eventualities, how many steps had been anticipated and carefully thought through. And, there were literally thousands of vessels involved.
Yep.
And every single captain was given this, whatever it was, I've forgotten now, 900-page book of instructions. And so someone or some committee actually went through and came up with the content. It's not 900 pages of, do the right thing and we'll be. It's actually specific instructions. So every sort of eventuality for them has been considered. And for every, I hope I get this right, for every 3 bombs dropped, 2 were dropped away from the target area, the landing zone, in order to mislead. And that whole operation of what was done in order to mislead and misdirect with the non-existent British Fourth Army in Scotland and the non-existent First Army in southern England. They're just extraordinary things that were anticipated and planned for in real detail by, as you say, people who didn't have mobile phones, didn't have computers. It's just this image of literally thousands of people sitting around with, if they were lucky, typewriters, otherwise pencils and slide rules, a device which has always been a complete mystery to me. I'm so old that when I was at school, gifted maths kids had slide rules, but I never bothered because I couldn't understand what they did, and I still don't. I don't know what logarithms are. But anyway, that's how they worked it all out. And it's just that and someone came up with the idea of FIDO, the oil pipeline under the water. Someone came up with the idea of the Mulberry Harbours. It just wasn't, which is, when you think about it, why the idea of Operation Sea Lion is unconvincing. Anybody who looks at what's involved in an amphibious landing on a scale equal to the landings on the Normandy beaches would understand that you can't leave anything to chance, and you have to plan all of this, and we have to have all of the right equipment. It has to be in the right place. But somehow we have to do all of that without the enemy being completely confident that they know when and where it's going to happen. And they achieved all of that, and I think that's quite remarkable.
Absolutely. There's even one quote in the series where one of the eyewitnesses says they're told at the time, okay, you're going to be on landing craft 59. And he stands and says, oh, yeah, whatever, that'll never happen. And sure enough, a few minutes later, landing craft 59 arrives.
Yeah, that's right. He's a Liverpudlian, and I went to Liverpool to interview him. And he's the one who told the story about, so he landed as with the commandos, and the guy next to him had his arm shot off, and he says, he was just sort of looking odd and looking at his shoulder. But then he's the one who then leads them ashore, and they get into the village, that was their objective on day one, and he goes up and he goes up to the village church and pulls out his pistol. As he describes himself, as a rough, tough commando, and he's going to shoot his way into the village. And there's a tap on his shoulder, and it's the local priest who steps forward and opens the door for him. So there's these moments in warfare that just make it all seem quite bizarre.
Bizarre, doesn't it? There's a simple solution there. Speaking of the eyewitnesses, now in this D-Day episode, there's two eyewitnesses. There's Leon Gautier, the Free French Commandos, and then there's Johannes Berner of the Wehrmacht. And they seem to look like they were interviewed in the same location. Am I correct on that?
Yes, it's one of those lovely stories of sort of, I guess, what happens to people when wars are over and they take off their uniforms and they look at each other. So Johannes was captured. I think he was captured in the Falaise pocket.
In the Falaise, yeah. He was captured by the Canadians.
After the war, he went home, but then home was going to be East Germany. And so he didn't want to stay there and made his way back to France. He'd fought in the Normandy campaign, and he quite liked Normandy. So he sort of went back to Normandy to try his luck. And Leon was a Free French commando. He'd been in the Navy, the French Navy, before the war, and happened to be in the UK when France fell, and he heard de Gaulle, and was one of the minority who decided to throw in their lot with de Gaulle. And he landed on D-Day as a French member of the French commando on one of the British beaches. After the war, he stayed in Normandy. He opened a restaurant. He had in England married a local girl, so he was married to an English girl, and they settled in Normandy. And Johannes married a French girl and settled in Normandy. And the two met, and they were virtually next-door neighbours.
Incredible.
And so all these years later, someone brought this story to my attention. It was written up in a magazine, a French magazine. And I managed to get in touch with them, and we drove out to Normandy. And I think it was in Leon's house. In fact, I'm sure it was in Leon's house, that we interviewed these two former enemies who had been friends for, 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah.
Plus,
and interestingly, Johannes, I offered, because my cameraman could have handled it, I couldn't, for him to be interviewed in German. Mm-hmm. Leon, I interviewed in English, and Johannes didn't speak English well enough, in his opinion. But he said, no, he didn't want to talk in German. He'd be interviewed in French. So,
wow.
Yeah, so there you are. There's a sort of enemies who, I guess, look back on 50 years and think, why were we shooting at each other?
Why were we doing that? Just after D-Day, Operation Ichigo was launched, which was the invasion of China to reach Indochina. In there, you point out that 60% of Japanese losses were from starvation and disease, not in fact from combat. Now, in a show called The Price of Empire, how do you think Japan was ever going to build an empire if they couldn't, or didn't even intend to fully sustain it?
Well, I think one of the things to point out is the extraordinary figure that you just cited of how many people were involved in planning D-Day. There were, landed on the first day, 156,000. Mm-hmm. And how many people did we say were involved in the organisation of D-Day? 3 million. Right. So that's a figure which is totally in opposition to the Japanese way of making war. I think in the Pacific Theatre, something like 14 Americans in the tail. So that means for every combat soldier or Marine or sailor, there were 14 Americans in support.
Wow. So
that would be in, the
manufacturing to logistics
but more importantly, in terms of that sort of warfare, in medicine, So the medical services, the catering services, the resupply, engineering in the sense of the mechanics who repair things that get broken and all of that sort of thing. So there's this enormously long tail. And the Japanese tail was 1 for 1.
Wow.
And the consequence of that is the sort of figure that you've just cited. So with a 1 for 1 tail, the idea going in, but it was conscious.
Okay.
The idea going in was, well, you look after yourself. I mean, you live off the land if you have to, and you fix yourself up if you have to, and if you can't, you drop by the wayside. So I don't think that figure of 60% would have shocked the Japanese. It certainly wouldn't have shocked, I think, the Japanese High Command. That's how you make war.
If that was their conscious decision to do it that way. Yeah.
So I don't think they would have seen that as an obstacle to establishing the empire that they wanted. By the time they launched Ishigo, which was their largest offensive of the war anywhere, they had control pretty much of, those parts of China that were worth taking control of. The industrial centres, the seaboard, and so forth. Ishigo was partly an attempt to establish a land corridor to Indochina, to modern-day Vietnam and Cambodia, but also an attempt to, which was successful, to take out the airfields in China from which American bombers were operating.
Well, you also point out that the last Japanese soldier to surrender was in 1960. Nothing more gets explored about that in the show. It's just set in that. Do you know the background of that or how that came to be found?
Well, I mean, there were a few that there was. I think they were later than 1960. I think that was specific to one of the islands, I guess it was. It's not hard to understand. They were left for long enough in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa to create, and indeed even parts of the Philippines, to create substantial defensive infrastructure in the form,
caves?
Absolutely, in the form of caves and tunnels and so forth. So the fact that they had places where they could hide, which were well camouflaged, is unsurprising. So there they are. The battle washes over them. It doesn't stay.
It moves on.
It moves on. And they are then left. I'll tell you a story in a moment to prove it. But they are then left, and they are doing what they have been brought up to do, which is you go on fighting until either you're dead or the emperor tells you to lay down your arms. And in the case of some of these people who were so isolated, they didn't hear from the emperor.
They did not hear the radio.
Until someone got to them. The first time I went to Solomon Islands, the last man there who was representative of the colonial era was the superintendent of the port in Honiara. He was an Englishman.
Okay.
I got talking to him, and he was interested. He was typical sort of English colonial type, and he liked bushwalking. Honiara, which is now the capital, was not the capital during the war. It grew up around Henderson Field, which is the battlefield on Guadalcanal.
Okay.
So it grew up because that's where the Americans came ashore, and that's where they built up their supply infrastructure, and that became what is today the capital of Solomon Islands. Anyway. And this guy told me that only a few weeks before, he went for a bushwalk up into the hills behind Honiara. And there, in quotes, sitting at the side of the track was a Japanese soldier in his uniform, holding his rifle, with his helmet on, except he was a skeleton.
Oh, wow.
Undisturbed, because you're in that sort of terrain.
No one had been there.
People could pass him by daily for years and years and years, but never quite go along that little bit of a track or whatever.
The exact little bit.
And that's what that sort of terrain is like, and it's not just Solomon Islands. So I think the fact that some were able to hold out for a long time.
Stay isolated.
Yeah. If you think about their mentality, their hiding places and the terrain in which they lived. I think there will be many more who we'll never know about who died in those
still
years.
Fighting their war.
Well, exactly. So one guy gave himself up in 1960, but that's 15 years later. How many guys thought the war was still going on and didn't give themselves up because by 1960 they were dead and they're just unobserved skeletons somewhere in the bush.
Somewhere else.
Yeah.
Well, to shift gears a little bit, and I know we're jumping between quite major events here, to Operation Bagration. Now, is it Bagration, Bagration, Bagration? I hear so many different pronunciations of this. I'm not sure if there is an agreed version.
I'll tell you the agreed version only because I thought it would be Bagration. Your instinct is that you want to give it a French pronunciation and call it Bagration. Right?
That's right.
But that can't possibly be right until I went to Russia, not for this program, but for another.
Okay.
And I was interviewing people for another series. I interviewed people in Russia and in Ukraine and in Belarus, and they all said Bagration.
Bagration,
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And I said, is that how you pronounce it? And they were absolutely convinced, yes, that's the correct pronunciation.
That's great to know.
So he was Prince Pyotr Bagration. He was a Georgian hero. And of course, Stalin, who chose the name for that campaign, was a Georgian. And so he named it after his countryman. And Bagration was killed in the Napoleonic campaign in 1812. In 1815, and here's the sort of historical trivia that history buffs love, his widow, the Princess Bagration, became the sensation of the Congress of Vienna in 1815-16.
Right.
At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where it is reported she invented the see-through dress.
Okay. What an invention. We've got a lot to thank the Bagrations then.
Yeah, and regret that it was before the invention of photography.
Well, on a more serious note, during Operation Bagration, obviously it was the campaign that began the Soviet push, which eventually arrived in Berlin. Now, 90% of Germans who died in combat died on the Eastern Front. But during Bagration, there were more that died there than the preceding 5 years. What was it? Was it the intensity of fighting? Was it that their supply lines were already done? What was the failing?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, which I'm sure the different people who have really studied the Eastern Front in depth would have different answers. I don't think there would be a unanimity of thought, because one of the things that a study of warfare does, and you can read books about, the morale of soldiers in different situations and their willingness to kill in different situations, and a lot of studies have been done. So one of the things that is clearly of a potential contributor, not just the outcome of battles, but the casualty rates and so forth, is the morale of the force. So you have a force in 1941 smashing its way into the Soviet Union in Barbarossa. Mm-hmm. And that same force, not the same personnel, many of them have now died or been invalided out, but basically fighting, as it were, under the same flag, is now fighting defensively, is being pushed back. I think there has to be an element of the deterioration in morale that weighs on casualty rates. Mm. And another is the degree of training. And the best illustration I think of that is, funnily enough, is the Falklands War.
Okay.
So in the Falklands War, the British were never outnumbered by less than 10 to 1. But they were a professional army facing a conscript army. And the return of fire ratio was overwhelming. Okay. The defence. So the return of fire means if someone shoots at you, do you shoot back or do you duck? Okay. And if you shoot back, do you shoot back more than you're being shot at?
Right.
And the return of fire ratio more than compensated for the difference in numbers between the British and Argentinian forces. And I think there's an element of that to be read into the casualty rates in the last months of the war on the Eastern Front, because increasingly there are raw recruits or terribly weary
or incredibly
weakened,
young.
all of that. So that's another factor that I think has to be added. And the other thing, of course, which we can't in any way diminish, is that the performance at every level, from the highest level of command down, of the Red Army, of the Soviet Army, was immensely better in the last months of the war than in the first months of the war for them in 1941. They learned what they were doing. They made changes to all sorts of things. They reintroduced rank. They reintroduced shoulder blades and gold shoulder pads and gold braid and all that sort of stuff. So, it's interesting because they deliberately, as a response to what was happening, reduced the importance of the political commissars at the same time that Hitler was increasing the importance of the people who were supposed to go out and build up the Nazi will and all of that stuff. So I think there are a lot of factors that were involved in that, and those are a few of them.
So after D-Day, what's come to be quite a controversial operation, even though it was deemed a success, was Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France by the Allies, by the Americans. Now, why is there so much controversy surrounding Dragoon?
Yeah, I think the controversy is purely to do with the strategy that's involved. It's interesting that the British side, Churchill down, everybody, was mindful of the risk to Eastern and Central Europe of allowing the Soviet forces to advance too far to the west, as it were. And one of the arguments against Dragoon was that the manpower involved would be better used coming north out of Italy, striking for Vienna, Prague, and meeting the Red Army in that part of Europe. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the American command system and the American president didn't see it that way. What the American command system, and that's to say Marshall and Eisenhower, preferenced was the need to secure a fully operational port with which to support the invasion, which was Marseille, in order to support the invasion of Western Europe. And they, of course, they were a senior partner, and their arguments carried the day. The operation itself was relatively straightforward and met with relatively insignificant opposition, and it was successful. Whether or not an alternative strategy would have worked as the British suggested it would, and whether the Normandy breakthrough would have been successful without the support coming from Marseille and from the south, that's in the area of hypotheticals, not of knowable history. But I think it was at that strategic level that the arguments were being engraved.
So do you think then, later, towards the end of the episode, you mentioned where Churchill and Stalin met on the 9th of October in 1944 in Moscow, and where they somewhat casually divided up Europe. Do you think that this secret meeting, the secret Balkan Spheres of Action agreement, do you think that was Churchill in response to Dragoon? Was it him holding on to power? What was that?
I think it was him being pragmatic in producing what he himself called his naughty bit of paper. Yeah, I mean, if he had been successful in persuading his allies that they should move to block the Soviet advance westward, then perhaps he would have approached that situation differently. But as you say, we're getting towards the end of 1944. We already know that the Americans, or more particularly, I suppose, more accurately, the Allied High Command, in the form of Eisenhower for one, don't agree with this strategy of driving through and driving for Berlin. He's already indicated the line on which they will advance, which effectively has told the Soviet Union that they're not going for Berlin.
They're not going for Berlin.
So Churchill's being pragmatic. He knows that he's lost that particular argument, and he wants to make the best he can in terms of spheres of influence out of a post-war settlement. But he's being a Victorian, as we know he was, and he thinks that he's Palmerston or Shaftesbury or someone like that. But the world has changed.
The world has changed. Empires have...
Yeah, and the role of Britain in the world has changed, and that naughty piece of paper, it's sort of held for a little while with the civil war in Greece. Stalin made a policy decision not to get involved, not to support the Greek Communist Party because he'd made that agreement. But ultimately, a fairly theatrical last hurrah, I think.
Speaking of that race to Berlin, we'll end this episode here, and next week we will dive into the end of the war with victory in Europe and victory in the Pacific.
Good.
Thank you for your time.
Find out how it ends. Excellent.
We're on a cliffhanger. Thank you again.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Chronicle's History Making Podcast. I'm Dan Jobson, and I've been talking with Michael Cove, creator, narrator, and writer of The Price of Empire.
You've been listening to a Chronicle podcast.